Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all for coming to the Data Visionaries series, Holding Data Hostage. I want to begin today by respectfully acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katsiye, Coquitlam, Kikite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tawasin peoples on whose traditional territories our three campuses of Simon Fraser University reside. I also want to acknowledge the traditional territories on our speakers and audience currently reside upon as well. My name is Fred Popwich, and I'm the Scientific Director of SFU's Big Data Hub and your moderator for today. And on behalf of Simon Fraser University, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the Data Visionaries, a series dedicated to bringing together pioneers in the field who are shaping and reshaping the world we live in. Individuals, companies, and organizations are generating huge amounts of data that are highly valuable and lucrative, a fact not lost on criminals and criminal organizations. Individual Canadians have lost over 48 million to cybercrime fraud in 2019, according to the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity and Statistics Canada report that also said that 1/5 of Canadian businesses were impacted by cybersecurity incidents in 2019. Cyber-related frauds in Canada skyrocketed during the pandemic, putting us all at risk for ransomware, cyber attacks, and illegal data distribution. So how can you and your organizations respond? To set the context for that, I'd first like to ask the audience if you know anybody that has been a victim of a ransomware attack. So I'm going to bring up a poll here, and if you want to click on one of those choices, either yes or no. And unfortunately, our hosts and panelists aren't allowed to vote, so it's from the audience. We get to see who is able to vote. We'll give you about 30 seconds to answer this poll right there. Notice if you're allowed to know yourself as well. So if you know anybody, if it is yourself, feel free to vote yes on that one as well. And I guess we were ambiguous in the question of knowing anyone. If you heard things on the news, question of whether you know them or not is I guess one of the issues there. So we'll give you about, let's get about 15 more seconds to vote. As I can see my countdown in the corner there. And we are not collecting this data so that, to put you at risk for something as well. So it's an anonymous poll. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's transition right now. And in terms of this, so while we have a 50-50 split roughly, where basically half of us out there in the audience know of somebody that's been a victim of a ransomware attack and half do not. So it's interesting to get that additional background, which is something I really wanted to have our panelists to know what kind of who we are talking to in the audience out there. So before we dive into our panel discussion, though, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and we'll be giving them 30 seconds in a moment to say something about themselves. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Uwe Glesser, a professor of computing science at Simon Fraser University, whose research interests range from formal engineering methods to mathematical modeling of discrete dynamic systems to interdisciplinary applications of computer science in situation analysis, anomaly detection, big data intelligence, criminal network analysis, predictive policing, maritime security, and cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. So you can see why we wanted to bring him onto this panel. And Uwe, welcome. And perhaps you can say in perhaps 30 seconds on what you find most interesting about your work. Over to you, Uwe. Who's muted?
Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Fred, for the introduction. So, of course, SFU is a great working place. Having colleagues like you, it's always fun to interact. But what I like the most is working with my students, for the most part, my graduate students, trying to get them excited on trying to solve challenging problems in knowledge transfer and development of new technologies around, big data, in the field of big data, data analysis, predictive analytics. We use data mining, machine learning, deep learning in a variety of application fields. And so what's really interesting in this is going beyond academic research in this pure sense of academic research, working with industry partners and government organizations, trying to help them to apply new methods to solve problems they have in a more efficient and more effective way. And in all of the fields that you mentioned, I've been doing this for about 20 years. And so this, gives some special insights into new fields for us and for my students that certainly make our work more exciting than just publishing papers. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Uwe. Panning over to visually on my left here, I can see Sean Weiss, a systems engineer manager at Fortinet Canada, where he manages a group of systems engineers responsible for advising, consulting with solution partners and customers on mission critical security issues, dealing with compliance, mitigation risk, protecting digital assets, and advanced threat protection. Sean, how about 30 seconds from you about what you find most interesting about your work?
Sure. Yeah, that was a great question. So I specialize more on the public sector side of our business, and so I get to work with a fairly diverse set of provincial and law enforcement, municipality kind of customers who really look to us to help bring that actual practical knowledge on how to develop security strategies and protect against things like ransomware and malware and cybercrime in general. So it's never a dull day. I mean, every single one of them has maybe similar, but different incidents or different breaches or different kind of requirements that never seem to be the same. So it's never a dull day. I just love working with that kind of customer set because it is really important with things. When we talk about critical infrastructure, hospitals and healthcare, law enforcement. These are important problems to help solve.
Great. Thanks, Sean, for that. The context there. And Sean is joining us today from Calgary, so from the other side of the Rockies there. We'll let you know what weather system is on its way after it's come through here on Thursday. So thanks very much, Sean. Et aussi, nous avons Michelle Mullen, the Director General of Partnerships and Risk Mitigation at the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. The Partnerships and Risk Mitigation Directorate is responsible for providing IT security advice, guidance, and services to Canadian critical infrastructure organizations and for advancing collaborative relationships with private industry to strengthen cybersecurity practices in Canada. So, Michelle, over to you for 30 seconds about what you find most interesting about your work.
Sure, thanks, Fred. So ditto to everything my two esteemed colleagues said in terms of the collaboration aspect and the variety of aspects. But for me, I would say the other thing I really like about this line of work is just the sort of the thrill of the chase, for lack of a better phrase, the idea of the cat and mouse aspect of this, always trying to innovate, to stay a step ahead of threat actors as they innovate and find new ways to undertake malicious activity. We too have to innovate to try to find ways to cut them off at the pass and force their hand to spend more money and take more time before they're successful in what they're trying to do.
Oh, great. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Michelle. And yeah, I'll be passing the baton over to you shortly. And I believe are you joining us from the Ottawa area today? Is that right?
I am indeed.
So we're covering the 3 of our time zones, so that's great. So thanks very much, everyone. And actually, throughout the session today, we invite you to write your questions for you in the audience into the Q&A box, which you'll see on the bottom of your Zoom session there. You have the option to upvote questions already asked or write your own. And what we will do at the end of the first hour of the panel session, we will answer those questions live, or you may even type a response depending on the number of questions. Overall, the whole session is we're going to be going for an hour and a half in duration. First hour is going to be with some prepared questions and presentations we have, with opening up the last half hour to your questions. And the warning, because I'm also an academic, if you don't come up with questions, I might create a test afterwards and come up with my own questions. So it's a bit of a warning there. So please, if you have any comments or technical questions, you can write them in the chat, because we have people in the back room, as they say, being able to solve some of the problems you might be having. We'd also ask you that you respect our community guidelines, which are to be as present as possible. Thoughtful questions are welcome in the Q&A throughout the session. And if your question is for a particular speaker, put @name for the name of the person's name, like @Michelle or @Sean or @Uwe at the beginning. And if there are inappropriate questions or comments, they will be removed. And if anyone continues to behave inappropriately, we will remove them from Zoom. So as I commented, as time allows, the presenters will address as many of the questions as they can during the QA session. And a reminder again, for those that joined late, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing the link after the event. So to get us started, I'd like to pass things over to Michelle to speak about ransomware then and now. So over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Fred. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hope that everything goes well. Let me know if you see the...
Hey, this is a good start to our day so far.
Yeah, good. I'm not fired. So thanks again for having me join you. It really is a pleasure. I won't go into who I am again, because you've kindly introduced me already. But I think for me, the interesting thing about today's panel is going to be the fact that we get to explore this subject of holding data hostage from three completely different points of view: the government, academia, and industry. And although we collaborate in this space quite extensively, I'm sure we all have slightly differing opinions on what actions might be the most appropriate to take, or perhaps the biggest payoff. So let's get started. Before I get into sort of all of the details around ransomware themselves, I am going to talk a little bit about the different threats and the sort of evolving threat landscape here in Canada, and then explore in more detail exactly how ransomware works. See if I can get this to work. There we go. Okay, so let's start by defining what ransomware itself is, just so that we're all on the same page for this part of the discussion. So ransomware is typically a type of malware that either denies a user's access to a system or data until a sum of money is paid. And it either, when it infects a device, it either locks the screen or encrypts the files, either way preventing access to the information and systems on the entity's devices. And threat actors can also use your compromised network to spread the ransomware to other connected systems and devices. And in general, there are two different prominent types of ransomware out there in the ecosystem. The first is crypto ransomware, which removes access to your files by encrypting your data. And the second type is referred to as locker ransomware, which actually just blocks the login access to your devices. And once these devices are infected, usually it's by clicking on links or downloading attachments from unsecure websites, phishing emails, social media accounts, etc. But threat actors often scout your networks in advance for information that they can use to then exfiltrate and monitor your communication methods prior to deploying the ransomware. And that is because their goal really is to find a target that will pay off. So they really are doing some, I'll say, advanced research before they target people now. So once your device is actually infected by ransomware, you'll typically receive a notice on your screen in some form, indicating that either your files have been encrypted and rendered inaccessible, or that you're going to be denied access to your files until a ransom is paid. And in some cases, threat actors have even begun to make it look like this action has been taken by law enforcement in order to try to legitimize the request that they're giving to you. The message will then instruct you to pay a ransom in order to have your device unlocked, and payment is usually requested in the form of digital currency, such as Bitcoin, because the transfer becomes more difficult to trace after the fact. Prepaid credit cards or gift cards may also be requested for the same reason. Normally, you will be provided with a time limit within which to pay the ransom, after which threat actors may increase the ransom amount, destroy your files permanently, or leak your data. And as an additional extortion method, a threat actor may even threaten to release your data publicly if you don't pay the ransom. Let's talk a little bit now about the threats that we're seeing in the evolving threat landscape overall here in Canada. The bottom line is that cyber threat actors, and by extension the threats they exert on society, are not static. They evolve over time, and consequently, we must constantly refresh our understanding of what techniques, tactics, and procedures, or TTPs, are in vogue at any given time in our ecosystem. So every second year, the Cyber Center publishes an unclassified version of our National Cyber Threat Assessment. And back in 2020, it was assessed that to date, cyber threat activity against Canada's critical infrastructure consisted mostly of fraud and ransom attempts by cybercriminals, as well as some espionage for the purposes of IP theft and prepositioning by state-sponsored actors, all of which we expect will likely continue. Likewise, cybercrime was still found to be the #1 most likely threat to affect ordinary Canadians. Motivated by financial gain, cybercrime actors often adapt their malware campaigns to maximize profit. And recently, these actors have been moving away from the previously used automated scattershot campaigns towards the more strategic targeting of large organizations, including critical infrastructure operators. This model of targeted ransomware attacks is called big game hunting, or BGH. Big game hunting, the central tenet of it really is that high-value organizations can't tolerate sustained disruptions and are thus typically willing to pay significantly larger ransoms to restore their operations. In fact, between the third quarter of 2018 and the first quarter of 2020, the average ransomware payment in Canada increased from less than $20,000 to over $160,000. That's an 8-fold increase in less than 2 years. And ransomware activity continues to grow because it's so profitable, and critical infrastructure operators and other large corporations tend to pay because of what's at stake. Threat actors have become more covert in their operations as well by first gaining access to an organization's infrastructure, including their communication systems, to identify critical systems, high-value data, personal information, and data that could cause reputational damage if leaked to the public. Taking advantage of the pandemic posture that many organizations have assumed in order to restore productivity rapidly, threat actors often deploy the ransom to the data sets and systems of highest importance or value, leaving the organization compromised. And in addition to this tactic, threat actors actively monitor the communications and planned recovery actions of an organization to undermine response efforts and to further infiltrate networks and connected devices. So in essence, we characterize the trend in ransomware here in Canada as increasing in intensity, since they now pursue higher value targets with higher payoffs than previously undertaken. And the reconnaissance activities that they're undertaking in advance increase the likelihood of success beyond those sort of scattershot random attacks of the past. So finally, let's explore exactly how ransomware attacks occur. Ransomware has become more sophisticated and often employs a combination of attack vectors, such as sending a phishing email to your organization, along with brute force attacks. Organizations connected via their supply chains can actually have ransomware spread laterally because of the prevalence of unpatched software and vulnerabilities. For example, an organization who provides services to their clients via interconnected networks and client management systems could be targeted by ransomware. The threat actor could then use the interconnected networks with unpatched systems to infect other organizations within the supply chain with the same ransomware. And these organizations would then be locked out of their systems as well, disrupting their operations. This diagram here really provides a visual representation of the threat actor's most common points of entry, the 3 boxes across the top, to infect networks and devices, highlighting the 3 main access vectors commonly used in ransomware incidents. Brute force, which is essentially password guessing, exploiting vulnerabilities in your software, or executing phishing attacks. The diagram also highlights down the left in red 3 stages of a ransomware incident. The threat actor first gains access to your network, then takes control of your systems and connected devices, and finally deploys the malware payload and infects your systems and connected devices with ransomware. So once the threat actor has full control of your network systems and devices, that's when they're going to encrypt your data, delete available backup files if they can find them, and often even steal your organization's data for sale or later use. They may threaten to leak this data if you don't pay the ransom, or they may say they will decrypt your data and restore your access to it if and only if you pay the ransom. So the decision of whether to pay or not really comes down to risk tolerance. It's going to be a difficult decision. You may feel pressured to make a decision quickly or to give in to their demands rapidly, but before you pay, you really need to contact your local police department and report the cybercrime. Paying the ransom does not guarantee access to your encrypted data or systems, and ultimately the decision to pay the ransom is your organization's to make. But it's important that your organization be fully aware of the risks associated with paying ransom. For example, threat threat actors often use wiper malware, which actually alters or permanently deletes your files once you pay the ransom. Payment may also be used to find or to fund other illicit activities. And even if you pay, threat actors may still either demand more money later, continue to infect additional devices or your partner's devices, retarget your organization later with a new attack, or copy, leak, and sell your data to other criminal elements that will come after you in other ways. The bottom line is it's really about risk tolerance, and the threat actor knows that because they've studied you. That's, I think, it for my opening remarks, and I think we can head into the conversation from there.
And I was the one muted this time in terms of that. Thanks, Michelle. I think your presentation gave us some ideal context for our discussion. And to focus that discussion, we're going to start with 3 questions. And so let's go to the first one. And while I'm reading it, I'll let Sean know I'm going to tap him on the virtual shoulder tap. So I'll ask him for his thoughts first. So the first question is a multi-part question. We are hearing more about ransomware in the media. Is ransomware increasing in Canada? What trends are you seeing? Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, I mean, Michelle kind of gave us some good numbers there. I've got some other ones too. And, the whole statistics side behind cybercrime in general and ransomware in particular is a bit of a nebulous sort of area of statistics, but because a lot of people don't report cybercrime, a lot of people don't report ransomware. So they're kind of tough to really, like, everyone's got a different set of data, I guess, is ultimately the issue. But we can take a pretty good educated guess that ransomware is here to stay. It's very successful for the hacker. And some of these trends that Michelle had kind of gone into is that they're definitely increasing in nature. They're increasing in their ransom demand itself. So when you look at some of the numbers from last year versus this year, in terms of the average ransom demand, they've gone anywhere from 3 to 4 to 10 times what they were last year. A lot of the customers that we've seen in the last 2 years, or organizations, I should really call them, have been a lot more on, at least from my perspective, and again, I'm a bit biased here because I deal mostly in public sector, but you see a lot of critical infrastructure type of folks being targeted. So healthcare in particular, critical infrastructure, like waste and water, companies like that, right, or organizations like that are being targeted because this is critical infrastructure. These this isn't just some mom and pop shop, some dry cleaner, and I'm sure ransomware is important to them too. But this is stuff that's affecting society as a whole. So these are some of the trends that I'm definitely seeing from a statistics point of view. Maybe a few other segues into some trends, though. One of the things that we're seeing as well at Fortinet in our kind of customer base is the rise in what we call ransomware as a service. So you've all heard of that term, or maybe a lot of you have heard of that term, script kiddies. And this term comes from someone who wants to be a hacker, but is maybe not completely well versed in the ability or having the resources on their own to execute some sort of cybercrime activity. So this is where ransomware as a service comes to the rescue for these people. Is it helps the less resourceful or the less capable person become that hacker by renting services and resources from nefarious organizations who are renting out their talent and their capability. And in fact, one of the most famous examples of a hacker who used ransomware as a service is right here in Canada. And it's funny, we like to always blame, the traditional sort of, North Korea and Russia and China and all these people as being the source of cybercrime. But we have a great example right here in Ottawa, right next to Michelle there, of someone who raked in $27 million last year in ransom by using ransomware as a service. He was actually just caught this year and was charged in the US. And I think he's been extradited already as well for those crimes. So ransomware as a service, this is becoming huge. This is letting all sorts of people who never had the technical capability become a bona fide hacker.
Yeah, that gives some interesting context there. Thanks very much, Sean. Uwe, over to you. Your question, the question again being that given that we're hearing more about ransomware in the media, from your perspective, what are you seeing about the increase in ransomware in Canada and what trends are you seeing? Uwe?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I completely agree with what Michelle and Sean said. Clearly, ransomware is on the rise. Some speak of a ransomware epidemic. And so we have, over the past 6 years, certainly seen a significant increase. And there's no reason to assume this will get better anytime soon. According to data I have, say there was a recently published report by the 2021 Cyber Threat Defense Report by the CyberEdge Group, absolutely confirming the other numbers that we have heard. And what I find personally particularly troublesome is the fact that, years back, the threat actors were casting the net wide, trying to collect, ransom from many small amounts from many people, like the WannaCry malware. A few years back, more than 300,000 computers got infected worldwide, just in a couple of days. And one had to pay, $300, I think it was, for the most part. Wouldn't get back the data anyway. That was a little disappointment. But now we see more and more highly targeted attacks. And I think a good example for this is the attack on the Colonial Pipeline, cutting the East Coast in the US off from fuel for about a week. And in fact, they had infected their business network first, and then Colonial Pipeline decided to turn off their operational technology because this was even more sensitive, but still they were not able to charge their customers for fuel or just record who is consuming how much. And this requires a major effort on the attacker side. And we see this happening more and more. And one reason for this is also that attackers have stepped up the kind of technology they are using nowadays. It's all getting so much more sophisticated. There is this notion of advanced persistent threats where they, after the initial intrusion, stay in a network for some 200 days on average, and monitor the network traffic, what's going on, trying through privilege escalation to get into other parts of the networks by getting to monitoring passwords of system administrators and such things. And apparently this is a very lucrative business. So this is then also, the cyber arena has becoming more and more interesting for organized crime, given that the revenues you can hope for are significantly higher, that the risk is fairly small, and the fact that they may not have the technical expertise is not really a limiting factor because they have the money to pay for it. And, as Sean mentioned, ransomware as a service has become very, very popular. And many people seem to consider this as a real alternative to work. So if we don't find a way to curb all this, we can just expect to be breached by some ransomware. And it's organizations, it's individuals, it's spreading rapidly.
Okay, thanks for that context there, Uwe. And actually what I'm going to do is pass the baton back to Michelle, just in terms of because you've already started talking about some of the aspects of how more sophisticated these techniques have become. And we're also seeing, and that's going to actually be part of our second question, but to the focus just on the increase and the trends in terms of this. Michelle, is there anything you'd like to add from your presentation or to some of the things that you've heard Sean or Uwe talk about?
Sure thing, Fred. Sorry for the voice here. I think in addition to sort of the use of modern technologies like cryptocurrencies as aspects of how ransomware is propagating, the other thing we're really seeing is how the threat actors are really searching the globe for locations that have either lax or non-existent laws in terms of fighting against cybercrime in particular. And so ransomware activities are obviously going to be more difficult for cyber criminals to undertake if they're in a location where there are strong cybersecurity laws in place. Yeah. And so they're literally seeking places globally where that's not the case. And the thing that sort of is further frustrating in that is because those locations tend to be the same locations where we find state-sponsored threat actors, we find that they are now starting to work in cahoots, for lack of a better phrase. And so what that means is that we've got multiple state-level cyber threat actors that are using ransomware now to obfuscate the origins or the intentions of their cyber operations that might not actually be focused on ransom. But they will certainly associate with cyber criminals in their locations that will engage in ransomware activities in order to sort of gain access and I'll say cripple a target while they can then undertake their intelligence collection activities, et cetera. And what ends up happening is that the cyber criminals essentially provide assistance to those intelligence services, which allows the cyber criminals then to operate free from law enforcement. So because they're assisting a state-sponsored actor do their business, then they know the state-sponsored authorities won't go after the cyber criminals to take action on their activities because they're basically joined at the hip. Yeah. So we're definitely seeing evidence of that as well.
Okay, and actually that's a nice bridge to our second question, which I'll read out for everyone. And actually I'm going to be going back to Sean again to answer it first, just given some of the context of what we've just heard in the previous questions. So the question we had prepared, and thanks everyone for already raising some of the issues related to it, is that cyber attacks are becoming more sophisticated and frequent. And the focus of this question is we want to be hearing from your point of view how ransomware has evolved over time, and we've already started hearing that from some of some of your responses there. So that one aspect is evolution of ransomware. The second thing is this two-part question. Again, can't get the professor out of me. Tough questions here. Second, what factors are enabling the success of modern ransomware and cyber criminals behind the attack? So evolution and what kind of things are allowing them to be successful. So Sean, over to you. And I know you already started talking on some of this, the evolution aspect.
Sure, yeah. So just to answer the first question there on how has ransomware evolved. So in some ways it hasn't. It's largely using a lot of the same generic ways into the network, as Michelle had sort of described in that one slide, right? Phishing, password guessing, taking advantage of vulnerabilities. And that's really the way all attacks, by and large, will try to leverage. So from that perspective, it's kind of the same as it's always been. But there's certainly some things that have changed about ransomware. And some other facts behind ransomware that are changing the way that it's carried out. One of them is going to be the fact that it is getting more sophisticated. Some of the actual malware that's behind ransomware is becoming very intelligent, and that's largely to do with vendors that are trying to keep up, malware vendors in particular. But getting back to one example I gave earlier about the ransomware. The ransom as a service play. So there's the particular strain that had been used in that example was something called NetWalker. And NetWalker had a piece of malware that this gentleman was renting out, and it was using an execution called process injection. Sometimes it's called process hollowing. And this was basically a way for the malware to pretend that it was a legitimate process running on your machine. So traditional AV malware or AV detection programs weren't able and are not well able to protect against this kind of advanced malware, because they're looking for something that isn't legitimate. And when they would scan this process, it would look just like, in this particular case, it was Windows Explorer. And so the process looked like it was doing what it should. And so this level of sophistication is something we're now seeing in the realm of ransomware, as opposed to some of the less sophisticated stuff that we've been used to over the years. In fact, ransomware, when it first came out, if I, let's go back to a decade, it was really more targeted to the consumer when it first came out, and it's really evolved to really go after the corporation or the public sector kind of organization. And so as it's gotten into those kind of customers, because that's where the money is, and it's had to get more sophisticated in order to defeat the security capabilities that those organizations are going to have at their disposal. So I'd say that really that's where I've seen ransomware in terms of its evolution over the last little while.
Okay.
I think you had a second question on the back of that one, Fred.
Well, yes. So it was what has been enabling the success of modern ransomware? Okay. Yeah. What factors are for their success?
First and foremost, I'm going to say what drives its success is because people pay. Right? If people stop paying, we wouldn't have ransomware. We wouldn't have this problem. But people pay, and in fact, the stat that I saw most recently is 7 out of 10 Canadians will pay the ransom. So it works, right? If I was a hacker and I was getting 7 out of 10 odds, I mean, that's great. Highly successful. So that's first and foremost what's enabling its success. In fact, that brings up another point we should probably mention at some point today, is one of the trends that this is now fostering is there's some movement afoot to actually ban or make illegal the payment of ransoms. And so that brings a very interesting dichotomy or interesting dilemma to this whole problem, is if we make it illegal to pay, what happens then? But anyways, that's maybe another topic that we can get into. But again, some other factors that are enabling its success, and Michelle had mentioned this, cryptocurrencies. While cryptocurrencies are not in and of themselves an anonymous payment vehicle, they are very difficult to trace and track. So they do help enable, because everybody wants paid in Bitcoin, right? Nobody is giving you their bank account to send you the money to, right? No one is giving you their Visa to charge. So it's cryptocurrencies are making it easy for this sort of economic activity to occur. And while not impossible to trace, it's very difficult to trace. And some cryptocurrencies are a lot better at this than others. And so there's actually another segue we could jump into in terms of, what do we do with these cryptocurrencies? A lot of countries are starting to ban cryptocurrency, and others are cracking down on these cryptocurrency exchanges for making this problem an easy one for the hacker to facilitate. And Michelle also mentioned something that's very important too, is it is hard to catch these people, not just from a cryptocurrency point of view, but a lot of them reside in jurisdictions that makes it very difficult to get your hands on them. Even though you have all of the data, you've got all of the evidence and forensics, and you can almost pinpoint to the guy and the house that he's living in. Some jurisdictions you're just not going to get your man. And so that makes, that's also fostering the success of ransomware, is people hiding out in places where we just really, they're evading the long arm of the law. Okay. What else can I say here about ransomware in terms of its success? I think COVID and the pandemic, there's certainly something to be said for this in terms of ransomware's rise. It's no great shock that ransomware over the last 2 years has seen a huge jump. And that really correlates exactly with COVID. And because, so what happened with COVID? Everybody went home, right? Everybody stopped sitting behind the corporate network. And so all those great, expensive, fancy, sophisticated defenses that Fortinet would have sold you, and all of my other vendors in the world of cybersecurity, all of those things that we sold you to help protect your network, those all went away. Because when you went home, you're now on a laptop with your little antivirus software sitting behind your little Linksys home router. And so your ability to be protected when you went home is a lot less than it was when you were in the corporate network. And so users at home became a target, an easy target for downloading malware and for getting breached. And not because they want ransom from you and your machine, but they know that you're going to VPN back into your network. And now that you are their pivot point into getting that data back at the corporation that they so desperately want to encrypt. So that's the other enabler. I think we got to blame the pandemic a little bit to having changed this whole
definitely a change of the system. Definitely, yeah. The environment it's behaving in. No, great insights there in terms of that. And Uwe, over to you for how you, and from your perspective, not only to respond perhaps to some of the things that Sean has just raised, but from your perspective, what you see is the evolution of ransomware and what factors enabled the success of ransomware. Over to you, Uwe.
Okay, thanks, Fred. So I have to say, Sean had already some very good points. And I completely agree with this. I mean, of course, we could also blame the internet itself, but what's the alternative? So that doesn't really get us anywhere, so it's pointless. In this report I mentioned earlier by the CyberEdge group, they were saying that very clearly, you know, the increase we have seen over the past few years is fueled by the dramatic increase in ransomware payments. And they even call this the ransomware vicious cycle. Increased odds of recovering data entice more victims to pay ransom, which motivates more ransomware attacks. And how can we break this cycle? Now, apparently there is no easy way out of this situation, because for an organization that gets compromised by ransomware, what should they do? I mean, if they don't have, you know, enough backups to get their files back, and even with backups, we know it can be problematic, because often, especially in situations where attackers are in a system for a fairly long time before they really hit, then you know, the initial intrusion, the initial malware is in all of those backups, so it doesn't really get us necessarily out of the situation. And just not paying and live with the consequences is easier said than done. And there seems to be no good advice. And generally, from the perspective of the attackers, they seem to realize that actually paying, after receiving the payment, you know, giving a victim their files back or access to their machines back is a wise strategy, because it's good for their business model. They may want to come back at some point. And I think there is no easy solution out of this situation. And
okay, yeah, and actually, I think there's getting our way out of this situation is going to be an interesting thing for our third question. Before we go on to our third question, though, Michelle, is there? I know you'd started again talking about some of the evolution of ransomware. Anything more you'd like to say about that evolution, or about the factors that are enabling the success of modern ransomware?
Yeah, probably a lot of what I would have said has been covered by Sean and Uwe already, but I would probably boil it down to there being sort of three main things that I could point to in terms of the evolution. I would say the first one is automation. The second one is, I'll call it strength in numbers. And then the third one is about safe harbor. And so if you think back to the sort of original proof of concept ransomware that first hit, I think technically it was in 1989, which of course was the CryptoLocker ransomware that Evgeny Bogashev in Russian cybercriminal created back in 2013. He started to use it as a way of extracting additional value, I'll say, from victims that he was going after using other aspects of his criminal activity. So it was kind of like a way of adding insult to injury to folks he already had on the ropes. And so back in the 2013-2014 timeframe, according to the FBI, that particular ransomware approach affected about 500,000 victims and earned about $27 million Canadian overall. So sort of low level of reward for a high level of prevalence. But that was a lone wolf approach. That was a single guy with his associates going after each victim sort of one at a time. And I think we already talked about the fact that there's multiplicity being added now. So of course now, between 2014 and 16, they started to really go at multiple victims through multiple approaches. I already talked about those vectors of entry that were being used. But what they found was that there were very few victims that were paying, partly because it was hard and confusing and victims weren't really sure how to go about paying. So the irony is that what the threat actors did was started to develop automated processes to make it easier for the victims to pay. So they actually created sort of online 24/7 live chat support for their victims. They wrote up guidance documents on how to go about paying, and like really made it easy for the victims to actually execute the payment, which is something that wasn't happening before. So
it was good customer service.
Yeah, exactly. A little irony to that, I would say. And then also, I think Sean alluded to this earlier, not every cyber criminal is created equal, right? They're not all necessarily the sharpest knives in the drawer, and they might not always have the skills to perform the full life cycle of the hack that I demonstrated in the diagrams that I showed. And so they really are creating a band of brothers where they know a guy who knows a guy, and that guy will do step 2, and then he knows a guy who will do step 3, and then they all sort of share, if you will, in the proceeds. And so part of the issue is that it's evolved from a lone wolf attack to sort of a criminal compadre group that will then cooperate to execute the attack, which kind of just increases the impact that they can have. And then finally, there's that safe harbor piece that I talked about, and that's really where state-sponsored level efforts come into play, and they start to get top cover that they wouldn't have had before, and they don't have to run and hide. They can stay in plain sight, knowing full well that they're protected.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, thanks, Michelle. And and thanks to the audience already for starting to ask some questions. Just letting the audience know that we're going to be soon moving to the open QA session. So thanks for Michelle for answering the first question already. So this is now the time before we go into our last of the prepared questions, where you can start typing in your questions you might have in the audience, or start upvoting other questions in that. So, and I'm going to reverse the order on this one. Actually, I'll turn it completely reverse order. So I'm just warning Michelle that I'm going to ask her first, so that this way she's not having to say that, yeah, everybody else said all the good stuff already in terms of that. So this is the optimistic third question for all of us. So with respect to every organization, being concerned, it's the opportunistic and international threat of ransomware that we are dealing with everywhere in terms of that. What should we be considering today to risk becoming victims ourselves, or our organizations from becoming victims themselves? So I'm going to go with Michelle, then Uwe, and then Sean before we go to the question. So what should we be doing, Michelle?
It's a good question, Fred. I'll say in simplest terms, it depends who you are. I think the types of organizations that are being targeted by types of cyber criminals are different, because their motivations are going to be different. So yes, there's always an element of profit seeking, but quite often, as I've said, because they're pairing off now in some cases with state-sponsored actors or others with other intentions, who you are will drive a lot around what sorts of threats you need to actually protect yourself from. And so that's why the Cyber Center has actually started working with critical infrastructure owners and operators to kind of get a better sense of what specific threats they face. So for example, in that National Cyber Threat Assessment I talked about, we go into quite a bit of detail around critical infrastructure operators in the energy sector, for example, in particular, the electrical subsector, because we've analyzed in depth the details of the threat environment around those types of operations. And they do differ from other sectors across industry. I would say it's about improving coordination across the government entities that play a role in providing advice and guidance like we do, or in regulating, like some other federal departments are regulators in the space over certain sectors, and putting up good cybersecurity principles into the regulatory framework to make sure that folks are compelled to do what they need to do to protect themselves. And then I would say the third prong that we're really starting to work on is trying to influence the cyber insurance companies to not reward bad behavior, so to speak, but rather instead incentivize their clientele to take good protective or preventive measures in order to qualify for insurance, for example, so that folks are actually enticed to do the right thing before they become victims. And to that end, we've actually got a lot of advice and guidance on our website, and we're actually just about to issue a brand new ransomware playbook that actually has really practical steps for folks to take. I can just give you a little flavor of that. That really has a lot to do with, planning and making sure that your employees or you as an individual have some training to understand what sorts of things to look for vis-a-vis those three vectors, especially the phishing emails, what to look for, how to sort of suss out whether something's a legitimate outreach versus something that's intended to hook you. Lots of things about planning for recovery. So it's great to have a cybersecurity plan and some backups, but if you've never practiced how to recover, you won't actually notice if there's things missing in your plan. So we really talk about going through that practice process, looking through ways to store your backups in places that are going to be air gapped from your systems, so that if a threat actor is in your systems, they can't also destroy or encrypt your backups. That we see that a lot, unfortunately, that people store their backups online on their main infrastructure without their air gap, and sort of propagation issues. And then I would probably say there's a few other small things that can be done, like applying the principle of least privilege to making sure that people don't have overly escalated admin rights on systems, because that tends to be the manner in which threat actors are successful in gaining access. And then there's other things around disabling macros and segmenting your networks in order to limit the horizontal or lateral movement that can go on once you're infected. So that kind of thing, all of those mitigation measures actually address specific elements of how ransomware works. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to share my screen one more time. I actually have one additional diagram, I think, here that I can share with you.
Oh yeah, no, that would be useful. So
if this shows, let me know if you can see that. So in this guidance that we're about to put out, I'm giving you a sneak peek of it here, which I'm not supposed to do, but it just illustrates the point where I showed you the map of how ransomware gets undertaken. You actually see the different mitigation tools that we apply at each and every one of those steps, depending on the approach that's being taken. And you can actually pick and choose some of these mitigation elements and make sure you've got something on each one of these steps. And that really speaks to the whole concept of defense in depth that you hear us talk about all the time. And that's not about making a hard, crusty outer layer around all your information and then hope nobody ever gets in, because eventually someone's going to get in. The good ones always do. So it's about layering your defenses in depth throughout your systems at every possible access point, frankly, to protect against them succeeding at the next step, whatever the next step is in the process. And I will stop it there.
Great. Well, that was very useful. Thanks for sharing the screen there. And Uwe, I'll pass it over to you if you want to have some things that we should be considering today before I then pass it on to Sean for the industry perspective on it. Over to you, Uwe.
Yeah, thank you, Fred, and thanks to Michelle for covering already so many interesting aspects here. One thing I'd like to emphasize is there is definitely the need for raising more awareness around cyber threats and make both individuals and organizations understand that these threats are very real. It's not something that strangely always hit the others. It will eventually hit us. And I think one has to accept the fact that, one will be breached at one point. And then how one comes out at the other end of it essentially comes down to what Michelle already mentioned, the question of the response to a cyber attack, the mitigation efforts that are in place. And this will decide on, what ultimately the consequences will be of being compromised. So the purely proactive part that one used to have for many, many years, assuming if we just put the right, security perimeter around our IT systems in place, then we may never get compromised and you never get breached. I think that's not realistic anymore. One has to accept that a breach will happen, and then it's about, for a bigger organization, how fast can the breach be contained before it spreads through the entire system. And of course, this requires to have the proper tools in place, the right technology. And but I think it's not just about technology. It's a more holistic view of cyber threats, and the measures we can take requires to understand the need for technology that protects us, but it's also the need making individuals, like employees of an organization, understand that they have to follow certain rules. So it's technology, it's people, it's procedures, meaning they have to be trained to avoid the things like clicking on this email attachment or the link in the email, using proper passwords and proper password management programs, and multi-factor authentication. These are all fairly low-hanging fruits one can easily do without enormous extra effort. And the idea of doing this is to avoid to be an easy target. So in the end, there is no absolute security. One can just try to make it a little harder for the attackers than everyone else, right? That's sort of good enough. And
it's like encouraging your neighbor to leave their car unlocked. Yes.
So at the end of the day, it comes down to cybersecurity, comes down to risk mitigation and understanding, that just investing on one side and ignoring everything else is not the solution. So that's what I meant by having a holistic understanding of what we need to do. And once again, there seems to be a lot of reluctance on the side of many organizations to do the basic minimum. And we know from past attacks, like the one on Target was a very massive breach where in this Target retailer chain around Black Friday, they were stealing attackers were stealing the credit card information and personal information of about 40 million Americans. And in the end, it was very easy to break into their corporate network and navigate through this network, not because they didn't put measures in place, but they didn't enforce the use of those measures. Meaning people had to use passwords, but no one checked actually that, about 1% or so all use the same password.
No, some good examples there, Uwe. Thanks very much.
I leave it at this. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to pass it on to Sean for final comments about what we can do before we move over to the questions from the audience. Back to you, Sean.
Thanks, Fred. So I've said it once, I'll say it again. One of the things we can do to protect ourselves against ransomware is stop paying ransom. If we could all do that, it would go away. But let's move on from that conversation. So, in terms of protecting against ransomware, there's really not a lot that's different versus malware in general. There's a few things that are a little bit different with ransomware that we might want to emphasize as opposed to just malware in general. But by and large, protecting against ransomware is really no different than protecting against any sort of cyber criminal activity against your organization. And as Uwe was pointing out earlier, it really should all start with a very well thought out, articulate, strategic framework for building security around your network and inside your network. But very few people, I shouldn't say very few, but not enough organizations are taking security seriously enough. And I think a lot of them just don't understand how prevalent and how easy a determined attacker can be once he decides that you're going to be his next victim. But let's talk about cyber insurance for a second before I get too technical. So cyber insurance, I don't know if these guys are helping or hurting. And Michelle had brought this up. Some companies, and this is actually changing, a lot of companies, you would go to them with, like Uwe was talking about having a very nice strategic, organized, A to Z cybersecurity plan. And a lot of them, the response would be, well, that's okay. That sounds like a lot of money. I'm just going to go buy cyber insurance and they'll take care of it for me. So they were taking the risk and moving it on. But I don't think they really understood that they weren't really helping themselves. They were still going to get hacked. And so what happened to the cyber insurance company? Well, most of them don't make money. This is actually a losing proposition. This is a losing business for cyber or for most insurance companies. So what are they doing? And Michelle talked about this earlier. Most cyber insurance companies today are increasing their premium. I've seen anywhere from 2 to 3 times for renewal quotes. And what they're also doing, Michelle had mentioned earlier, is it's not just a carte blanche. You don't just sign up for cyber insurance. They send an auditor down. They'll want to see your diagrams, your strategic plan, your incident response plan, your disaster recovery plan. And if you don't have any of that stuff, your premiums go up even more, or they get to the point where they're like, you know what, you're a risk. You're not the kind of customer that we want to insure. So cyber insurance, I don't know. I'm of two minds about that one. But let's talk a bit more technical now, which is really supposed to be my area of expertise here in terms of, what do I tell customers to do from a vendor perspective on how to protect against things like ransomware. And one of the ones that I think Uwe was sort of bringing up that I'll bring down to a bit more technical level is segmentation. And I don't want to get too technical for the audience, but the idea behind segmentation is building out your security infrastructure to a point that you isolate the crown jewels from the riffraff. And what I mean by that is, take your weakest link or take your areas of weakness, the ones that are the places that are going to be exposed, or the devices and users that are going to be most easiest to expose or to download something they shouldn't, and isolate them as much as you can from where the data lives, because it's the data that they want, right? It's your intellectual property that they're after the most. And so you need to separate these two things from each other. And I heard the concept of least privilege come up. So that's part of this segmentation strategy, where you take your users, you put them on a user network, and you give them very limited access, only the very least amount of access that they require to do their job, and no more. And so that's what segmentation is all about. Because what happens then if we get a user on their device who gets hacked? That's all that gets hacked, or maybe a couple of other users. But if we haven't exposed the network, the data to that user, in a way that lets that malware propagate onto the data network, then we've limited our exposure. We've taken what could have been a massive problem and made it just a little problem. And so segmentation is a strategy that deals with that creates that ability for us to contain the problem. And as Uwe was talking earlier, most people are probably going to get hacked at some point. And so what really separates the professional from the non-professional is your ability to deal with the problem when it hits the fan. And so segmentation is part of that. It will limit the exposure and it'll limit the scope of the problem versus not segmenting or having a poor segmentation strategy.
Yeah, no, that gives us some interesting ones to think on there. And, like in terms of the way of approaching it, I think you've raised some interesting ones. I already see some of the points that you've raised being posted in these questions that we're seeing here. So thanks very much, Sean, for that context there. So yes, why don't we turn it over in our last few minutes that we have together here to the questions that have been posted to the from the audience. And I will do some paraphrase and some of them are longer, try to pull out the key things. And based on the upvoting, I'd be interested in hearing maybe all of you respond to this, and particularly one of the focus of one of the questions is it possible to use machine learning to fight these highly successful attacks? So anybody want to volunteer to take that one first? Michelle, you're first to unmute.
I had a feeling. Okay, so the bottom line here is that we only get more intelligent about what to look for once we've seen it once. And so that's why you'll hear a lot of talk about commercial indicators of compromise feeds, et cetera, threat intelligence feeds, for lack of a better phrase. And it's really important that whether you're a critical infrastructure operator or a private sector company, that you work with commercial threat intelligence feed providers that have a sensor footprint across your sector. There are certain products that are sort of sector specific, and the insights will be a lot more germane to the types of threats that you're most likely to be exposed to. So that's one thing. There are a lot of aggregating type actions going on. For example, we actually have a service that we offer, a threat feed that we give to our partners that combines some of these commercial threat feeds with our own sensor base that we have applied across the government of Canada. And so we see a pretty wide range of styles of attacks and indicators of compromise, et cetera. And we do pull all of that, and we use a lot of analytics and a lot of, I'll say, machine learning enabled capabilities to try to aggregate that insight and put it in a form that's shareable to our partners, and that can then be ingested at our partners' locations and then used to scan their own environments to make sure that the repeat performances of something that's been successful in one place aren't successful in other places. So I think that's what this question's kind of getting at, and absolutely we are in that space, as are a lot of these commercial threat feed providers.
Yeah, Fred, maybe I'll just add to that a little bit. So
Please.
at Fortinet, we use machine learning a lot in our next gen, if I could use that word, products. So let me kind of walk this back a step or two. So one of the problems we have in security, in cybersecurity in general as a vendor, is a lot of our products, especially legacy, we're only as good at detecting things that we know about. But the problem with cybersecurity is the sophisticated nature of the threat is there's a lot of these 0-day things going on. And what we mean by that is threats that we don't know what they are yet. They haven't been invented, or they're just being invented. And it's always this cat and mouse game where we have to wait for them to be invented until we know how to detect them. So machine learning flips that paradigm in our favor to some degree, or upside down. So use case, let's say Michelle logs in from Ottawa into the data center, and she consumes about a gig of database traffic every day. And as we use machine learning or artificial intelligence, we learn Michelle's behavior as a user, right? She does this from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and machine learning will come up with this baseline of what Michelle does with data. Then all of a sudden, we get Michelle logging in from the Ukraine, and Michelle all of a sudden consumes 15 gigs of the database on a Saturday night. Well, machine learning has built this baseline that's basically told us Michelle never does this. Michelle has never done this in her life, and this just seems abnormal, and it is a major deviation from the baseline that we've created for Michelle. And so that raises an incident. We now go, this is a user behavior that doesn't fit the profile anymore, and we couldn't be able to do that without machine learning at the center of that. And this is what helps us detect breaches in today's environment, without having any signature type of technology that tells us that there was something wrong, that there was an actual match between an IOC and our database of known bad things that we could match against. So machine learning is a new tool for vendors to detect this zero-day threat paradigm that we're actually being faced with more and more and more.
A good point there. And Uwe, yeah, over to you for about the machine learning aspect.
Maybe just to add one, and I completely agree too with what Sean and Michelle just said. Absolutely, machine learning is the way to go. For another reason as well, because for the highly sophisticated attacks, attackers nowadays also start resorting to machine learning and AI in the attacks, for instance, to cover up their tracks, to operate in a stealthy manner. And there are various techniques known how one can try to hide certain patterns machine learning would be looking for on the intrusion detection side, using masking and swamping. And I don't want to go into details here, but clearly this is happening. And then what do we do? I mean, on the defense side, we step up the measures we take, and then the attackers step up their measures. That's occasionally referred to as a dance between the attacker and the defender. And so the only thing that can beat AI is AI. And there's another reason for using AI and machine learning as a synonym. It's the speed in which we have to respond to an attack. We touched on this earlier, that it's very important once an intrusion occurs and is identified, to react and take countermeasures to minimize the damage, to contain the breach. And so, the good old days where then the experts come together have a lengthy meeting, what to do about this. Then by that time, it's all the damage is done. So, it has to be in real time. And the only way of doing this is fully automating the response. And this can only be done by software.
Okay, so if you ask, anybody want to talk clear on follow up on any of the machine learning things before I pull up the next question? I think we've talked on a fair bit of the issues there. So next question we have here that I wanted to raise for everyone is to focus on a specific kind of data. When a person commented that we're seeing an increase in ransomware in environments relating to health research data. And I was just wondering if anybody would like to make a comment on that, or why is it because it's more lucrative there, or why is there really an increase in ransomware in that environment, or is it what's driving that? Does anybody have any insights?
For me to start again, I'll just warm up the crowd for my two colleagues. So for sure, since the onset of the pandemic, we've absolutely seen a focus on health research information, especially vaccine development related information. We've been working very closely here in Canada with a huge network of biopharm, healthcare, you name it, sort of soup to nuts, the entire vaccine distribution network, all elements along the way, because criminal elements, in addition to state-sponsored elements, of course saw the global race to get to the finish line first, who would be the first to develop a vaccine and therefore get the pointy end of the profit margin for that, et cetera. And so there was a lot at stake. as well as sort of a heightened awareness on behalf of, frankly, most citizens wanting to know that their country was somehow out ahead of some others and that they would maybe get protected first. And so I think they really did prey on the fear factor that's going on within society. And I think also, you know, as sad as it is to say, there is a side effect of the research community's desire to work in an open collaborative fashion that tends to work at cross purposes with our desire to see networks segmented, locked down, protected at multiple layers, and with least admin privileges possible in order to decrease, I'll say, the threat surface through which these actors can be successful. And so it's really that dichotomy between how research works, regardless of whether it's health or any other type of research, and what you've got to do to actually protect networks, and therefore the crown jewels of the information, the intellectual property that researchers are actually working to develop. And then I would say the last thing, certainly in Canada, that makes the health sector a particularly tricky sector to help protect is that certainly in Canada, you know, the health sector is not regulated at the federal level. It's a provincial jurisdiction, but even the networks and the provision of systems for those provincial healthcare networks are not managed at the provincial level. They are often regional, sometimes even local. And so even if we're working with a particular province and helping them raise the bar in terms of their expectations of their constituents, it doesn't get applied automatically. There's a lot of sort of trickle down work necessary to get to all the different entities within that health network. So there is no one place to go to apply protection and have it work on everything that falls below it. So I think it's also just the manner in which our jurisdictions work here in Canada. And
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and thanks for that comprehensive answer. No obligation, Sean or Vivek, do anybody want to add more of that to health data, since there's a lot of interest in it?
Yeah, so I work with the healthcare a lot. It's probably my most predominant customer base. One of the big issues I face with healthcare, especially when I talk to my colleagues in the States, is our healthcare is public funded. And in the States, it's privately funded and it's big money. And they have lots of resources compared to the public sector. And I think, you know, all the bureaucracy and all of the limited funding, that exasperates the issue sometimes, I think, with both post-secondary as well as because we were kind of picking on post-secondary a little bit, and I'll pick on them again in a second. But healthcare has a tough time, like other big, large public sector organizations, in getting the funding for cybersecurity. And that exasperates the problem. And not having something like HIPAA, like they do in the States, that says, you want to be a hospital, then you shall get certified with HIPAA. We don't quite have that mandate up here. We don't have the teeth in our regulations to make a hospital do all the things that it should do. Now that's slowly changing. It's a lot better than it used to be, but it's different. It's night and day difference from the States, and it's that private sector versus public sector thing where the purse strings just aren't what they are up here like they are down there. Now, just picking on the post-secondary a little bit, and I'm not picking on SFU. I'm not just saying that because I'm on your panel, but because SFU does a pretty good job, in my opinion. But that pervasive nature that Michelle was bringing up with research and development, I've seen that in universities time and time, where they want the least amount of security. They want the least amount of intrusion and obstruction and restriction, because this whole mindset of, we're a learning institution, like we can't block anything. We have to allow a collaborative framework for anything and everything. But that's led to post-secondary being probably one of the most pervasively invaded places in cybersecurity. It's just a wild west, and that's also been slowly changing as well. But I think universities need to tighten up a bit more and really try to figure out that happy medium between, let's protect ourselves while at the same time creating and fostering that ability to share research. I don't think we found it yet, but yeah, just my thoughts.
Okay, Uwe, any brief comments on that?
Yeah, just a brief
theme?
comment. What comes to my mind is there was not that long ago, maybe end of last year or so, a fairly prominent ransomware attack where the University of California at San Francisco fell victim to an attack where their research data, and I believe it was in their medical school, got encrypted, and they had to pay, I think it was a considerable amount. I think it was in the range of $1 million to get their own research data back. And without getting it back, their research came to a grinding halt. So it shows that, you know, this is another aspect we should be aware of, that we protect our own research data and at institutions from ransomware attack. I mean, it's something you normally don't think about, that something like this could ever happen, but.
Yeah, no, it's and thanks for that example there. We're rapidly running out of time here. I want to get through just maybe another couple quick questions before giving time for all of you to have a 1-minute wrap up. So think about your 1-minute wrap up for your take home message for everyone. There's a question that came in here targeted to Sean, since you talked about making a question said, are you able at all to elaborate on that proposed legislation? Like, where is it coming out about making ransom payment illegal? Sean, is there any public information you can point us to there, or any insights?
I'd have to look it up. I had it actually in my browser this morning, but I can find it in a minute or two. But in the States, there is a couple of legislators brought up a private members bill that want to make ransom payments illegal. I don't think they're going to get it this year. I don't think there's enough support for it, but the fact that we got rumblings of it occurring, and I also read that in Canada, it's also come up as well. I don't think quite to the same extent as the US, but I think over time, as ransomware keeps becoming more and more pervasive, it's not going away, it's getting worse. They're making more and more money every year. At some point, we're going to have to do something different.
Okay. So that there is information in the public, and hey, with a good search engine, we can see what we can find. So yeah. So what I'd actually like to do, seeing what the time is, I'm just going to go around the table then for your each. I'm going to be tight on the 1 minute there. So I'm going to be Uwe, Sean, then Michelle for your 1 minute wrap up. So what do we want to take home? What have we learned, Uwe? What do we need to do? 1 minute for you.
I think I have 2 key points. One is in general, we need to keep going, raising awareness about cyber threats, and initiatives on the cyber education side, cybersecurity education side, initiatives that we have at SFU with professional programs in cybersecurity. But we need more. We need this at SFU, at other institutions. There is a lot of demand for cybersecurity talent. That's one of my key points. The other one is around this dilemma that we discussed and couldn't really find or agree on a solution of what to do in the case of ransomware attack. Should one pay or not? I read recently about an initiative driven by the US government of building a task force that should ultimately put in place the rules, what should be done, or at least the guidelines of what should be done in case of such an attack. Yeah. They came up with a long list of very good rules. The one thing they couldn't agree upon is, should one pay or not?
No. So that's maybe back to, okay, with that bridging, okay, to Sean for your 1 minute wrap up from your side.
Sure. So I'm going to circle back again to what Uwe had brought up originally a few minutes ago, and just that whole idea behind having a sound security architecture, having something in place for disaster recovery, having something in place for incident response, and having a framework or a strategy for things like segmentation. Without any of that, when your time comes, and it will come, you're going to have a bad day, a bad week, a bad month. So just being proactive and, get your house in order, I guess is what I'm really trying to say. Find somebody somewhere to help you with that if you can't do it yourself. There's lots of consultants out there that can help. Even just trying to buy cybersecurity insurance can start that off. Because like I said, a lot of them won't even insure you anymore unless you've got these checks in place.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Great,
Actually,
okay.
maybe one thing I will add to that, if I got 30 seconds left. I also heard, and we mentioned this briefly a couple times, automation. You're going to see a lot more about automation from a protection point of view as time goes on. We talked about how threats we can't keep up with them anymore from a cybersecurity, cyber attack consumption point of view. And the answer to that is going to have to be automation. A lot of companies, organizations have always been very loathsome to hear the word automation, where things will get shut off automatically when an attack is detected. But pretty soon that'll be the only option left. I think automation has to be taken seriously, more seriously than it has been before.
Okay, great. And Michelle, over to you, your minute.
A minute. So I want to liken it to, being with a group of friends, being chased by a bear. You don't have to be the fastest runner, but you've got to be faster than at least one of your friends to run away from the bear, right? So we know lots of folks have installed antivirus software and other sort of baseline security tools. I really want to encourage individuals to think about themselves in addition to businesses. So as an individual, I would really recommend that folks consider installing domain name system filtering capabilities. We've actually partnered recently with CIRA, which is the .ca people, to develop Canadian Shield, which is a DNS service that's free for all Canadians to download. You just have to Google Canadian Shield and you'll find it. I recommend that every individual install that on their personal devices. And then if you're a business, the sort of corollary to that is to really consider installing domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance, or DMARC capabilities. We are working on that with our partners as well.
Great, fantastic. Thanks for those suggestions there. And thank you, everyone. We've had a very engaged discussion, and I know there are still questions, but we've just run out of time. So on behalf of the SFU's Big Data Hub, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us, and in particular for our panelists for joining us today. And our delivery team here at the Big Data Hub for making it so enjoyable. At SFU, we really pride ourselves on engaging with the community in all things data, whether they be events like this one, supporting new collaborations, or helping people and organizations with their training and talent needs. I look forward to connecting with you at our next Data Visionaries event. I'd also, if you'd like to learn more about Big Data SFU, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Fred Popowich, all one word there, or you can go to our website, sfu.ca/bigdata, and find out more there and about our courses, our events, and things like that. Or even just send us an email to sfu_bigdata@sfu.ca. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks very much to our panelists for a very engaged discussion, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all again very soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.